So, Dan, welcome to the Humaniiize Podcast. Really pleased to have you here today.
Thank you, Eric. No, super awesome to finally connect.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been reading a lot of exciting things about Earlywork. And for those who are not aware, Earlywork is a startup which was launched in September 2020 and began as a newsletter curating the best early career roles in tech and startups. And you guys have since gone on to raise 700,000 in a pre-seed round. So big congratulations there, Dan. And I think there are a lot of really interesting things that you're working on in respect to future of work. And I'd love to hear what your inspiration was behind creating Earlywork.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, look, to set some context, I studied computer science marketing at the University of New South Wales, one of the big universities in Sydney. And all throughout uni, I had the good fortune of just stumbling into kind of the tech and startup world, and had a ton of fun there, just in terms of really fast paced, really good culture, working on unsolved problems, and felt very connected to the sort of work I was doing. And meanwhile, I had so many friends who are still, doing stuff like, banking, consulting, corporate law, a lot of them working crazy hours and, weren't really enjoying it. They were struggling to find out what they wanted to do. And it was kind of in my final year of uni where, I was working at a 10-person startup, and I was just about to graduate. And I had so many friends just messaging me going like, hey, dude, where do you find tech roles? Where do you find startup roles? And started to realize there was this real gap in literacy in the university ecosystem in Australia where people didn't even know what pathways were out there, what sort of companies there were, how to even apply for these roles, what the hell is product, what the hell is growth, what's UX. There was just such a gap. And the newsletter really began as a very simple solution to a very granular pain point. It was, hang on a minute, there's a bunch of people out there who are searching for tech and startup roles. So they're going on LinkedIn or they're going on the university job board and they're typing tech internship, startup internship. But oftentimes people miss out on amazing roles just because they don't even know that exist. I'm like, that's a crazy problem. It's just absurd. There's so many talented people out there who could be working on these roles. So what I decided to do is start originally a fortnightly newsletter where, every 2 weeks I would curate a list of 10 to 20 tech and startup internships and grad roles based in Sydney. And the way I would do that is literally just going through every single job platform I knew that host these roles. So, you had LinkedIn, university job boards, you had, Jora, Seek, Breakout List, Breakout Careers, Startup Galaxy, Angel Co, Hatch. There are a bunch of these platforms kind of across, Sydney and across Australia more broadly. And the thesis was, if I can just do that job once, that's a job that everyone has to do. I'll just be saving people time. And so the newsletter really began. It was just with 10 subscribers, just with 10 mates who had been asking me for help, setting those opportunities to them. And as well as that, started to provide kind of free career resources. I was like, I spent a lot more time on internships than grades in uni. So I figured I'd, hand out a few things in terms of here's the resume I use, here's how I answer some interview questions, and thought that might be helpful for people. And I think the final component there was just, I realized from a lot of friends who were talking to me, many of them said oh, you're the only friend I have who's actually working in the startup sector. And so I wanted to start showcasing young people who were working in startups or building their own startups. And so we started off a 1-minute hustle interview series, doing interviews with young founders. And so, I think I really the inspiration began simply just help more people even just discover roles out there and just know how to get into them and see examples of other young people doing them.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I was wondering, Dan, how did you parlay that initial success you had and the traction with your newsletter into to a more viable business?
Yeah, super good question. And I definitely think we're still early, right? We're a pre-seed company. We're not there quite the crazy, venture scalable stage just yet. But I think what's helped us to turn this from just kind of a newsletter into a business, there are a couple of key decisions along the way. I think when I was doing the newsletter, I brought on my co-founder, Jono, and we started doing research of over 150 students across Australia. And we tried to understand, what were kind of the big pain points in terms of job seeking around tech and startups, career development. And kind of came to this data point where hang on a minute, if you could help people find kind of their dream grad role in tech and startups, people value that at thousands of dollars, because if you help someone land a job, you help them land a role that incrementally earns them tens of thousands of dollars, but also changes the learning trajectory and kind of the impact trajectory of what they do in work throughout their life. And so we originally kind of began experimenting with career coaching models. But I think, there were some struggles there in terms of trying to find an equitable model, just ensuring that, people could access that. And we decided to actually instead kind of put that on pause and turn our newsletter almost into a community. So it started with one-way communication, but we realized an opportunity that actually a lot of people working in this space didn't actually know each other super well. There was a lot of value in learning from each other. So we launched a community on Slack. I think it was in April of 2021, and kind of really from there, it's been such an amazing opportunity to build and aggregate just kind of a cohort and audience of young people that are just like super positive. Some helping each other in their careers, growing together. So then when you start to think about, okay, how does a newsletter become a business? Well, if a newsletter turns into a community and you've got this pool of young people with a shared set of interests, shared ambitions, they all kind of want to work in tech, sales, and social impact, or they're building their own thing, what you can then do is actually go, okay, how can we help those people like find awesome work opportunities? And so the natural play to start with becomes hiring. So in September, we originally launched a jobs board based around that community to help those community members find relevant roles. As in, rather than just putting in a list in the newsletter, we thought a job board was a easier user experience. Companies could easily submit roles on there. And so it was curating relevant roles for our community and then companies doing sponsored listings on that job board. I think now where the real monetization starts to come is actually around flipping the job board model and building a search engine for talent. And so what I mean by this is instead of a company submitting a listing, a candidate submits their profile, whether they're actively or passively seeking what they're looking for. And I think that's something that, a lot of, companies like really can't get from browsing people on LinkedIn today. Like, you've got a big pool of people, but it's hard to understand what they're actually looking for, whether they're actively or passively looking. So we originally built that in no code and we were kind of getting signups through that. But we've recently partnered with a company called Palette in the US, super awesome startup there. And so we kind of launched a talent collective with them that's now being used by companies like Finder, Leica, Avira. So a lot of cool, startups and scale-ups in Australia. And so early there, just testing with kind of our alpha cohort, but we're looking to scale that to the market in the coming months.
Fascinating. And you also mentioned something which I found very interesting and also resonated with me while you were conducting your market research, Dan. You said that there was a lot of confusion amongst graduates regarding the specifics of roles as well as even just the job titles themselves. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the nature of this confusion and why you think that problem exists.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about like university, like 2 out of 3 of us, like myself and Marina, who are 2 of the 3 co-founders, like both of us ended up in product management roles, but we didn't do a single product management course in university. Like, I think my very fundamental belief is like there is a big gap between education and careers, and particularly kind of the careers of tomorrow, or a lot of these tech, startup, and social impact careers. You think about university curricula and they take, time to kind of evolve and adapt, but a lot of these emerging industries are moving super quickly. So a lot of the practical courses around growth marketing and product and UX and data science, like a lot of the literacy and support isn't quite there yet in terms of universities, and the fields themselves change so quickly. Like even with computer science, like, what I learned at university doing computer science versus, what's needed for development in the industry is often, very, very different. And so I think it's like, there's a functional element of, universities like, take time to update their curricula. The other thing as well is I think a lot of career departments, universities don't necessarily have as strong a traditional grounding in a lot of these, more emerging fields. I think primarily they've got, a lot of strong literacy around, banking, consulting, corporate law, the big engineering firms, probably more traditional pathways there. And so it's like at an ecosystem support level, I don't think most universities probably aren't set up to really help a lot of young people into these future focused companies. And I think the final one as well actually just comes down to campus brand and also almost employer brand. Like when I remember like in university, like, in first year going to O Week, and you walk down kind of the O Week stalls and you'll see, kind of like Combank and Deloitte and like kind of these like, super big professional services and banking companies, and they've got the campus budgets and they've got the employer brand to be recognized by students. And so very early on, students go into university, and almost the track that they put on and the paradigm they go into is like, okay, I'm going to work at one of these like, big corporates, kind of like very established companies. I think a lot of startups don't have the financial resources or the expertise necessarily to really kind of like market their employer brand to early career talent. So there's a real opportunity there, like why I think like, Earlywork, there's a really awesome role to play in the ecosystem, is actually helping shine a spotlight on some of these earlier stage businesses where in fact candidates may actually learn a ton in like really fast paced environments, work on super cool problems. But essentially like we want to give that campus presence to a lot of, like as well as tech companies where, a lot of people still don't even know about like the big tech company opportunities if they're not doing computer science, startups, and then social enterprises kind of like working on a sort of for purpose mission. We think there's like a terrific opportunity to give them a stronger campus presence so that, people going into university, when they're considering the possible set of career options out there, are actually thinking about these as viable alternatives, not just, something that I might do in 10 years time.
Right. Yeah, that's super interesting. And I remember very clearly myself when I attended O Week, it was exactly as you described. It was very generic. And also, I think that there was a very narrow scope on the part of those companies which actually had exhibitions and stalls. They were looking for a very specific type of profile. And if you didn't match that, then you weren't really left with a lot of options in that context. And I think also perhaps the irony is that, at least from my personal experience, I've noticed that many friends I have who took the leap to work in a startup context actually ended up getting a lot more experience and maybe even financial remuneration through equity or just through a salary eventually, compared to those who went through a more quote unquote traditional career path. So I think that's very interesting what you mentioned there in respect to that.
Like even they mentioned like the remuneration part. Like a lot of people think like, oh, like startups are gonna be like super lowly paid. It's like it makes more sense to go into traditional industries, or it's like very risky. I think like 2 points there to make. Number one, something people forget is like, like if you go to like, a big four professional services firm or a big four bank, like you might be getting, 60K or 70K. You'll often get that at a startup alongside equity. And so there's a unique kind of differentiator there where it's actually, you're not just working for a business, you're actually owning a stake in the business. And so your upside is much higher in terms of like, if you're really helping to grow that startup super quickly, like you could potentially, and I don't want to guarantee this, a lot of startups fail, a lot of startups don't become unicorns. But there is that prospect there, for, significant financial return, which is something that's a differentiator in terms of potential upside versus traditional industries. And then I think kind of just the other point to make is around like job risk versus career risk. Like I think for a lot of people, they look at, kind of like maybe a traditional, like say a consulting type role, and they go, that's safe. It gives me optionality. I can go through things down the line. What they often forget is, by working in a startup, like, that startup could succeed, that startup could fail. But oftentimes because it's earlier stage, if you're working with, smart founders, like founders with a strong background, you might get a lot of autonomy and you might get a lot of very direct learning and mentorship. And so whether the startup goes, like well or not well is actually independent from like how much did you learn and how much of an impact did you have? Because if you've actually built really good skills from that time there, you might actually be in a prime position, to go move to another opportunity that's super, super fantastic. Like I've had friends who, being a part of startups, like very early stage, had incredible responsibility at a young age. The startup ended up, maybe not becoming an absolute superstar success, but they leveraged that skill set to either build their own startup or go join another startup that was like super, super awesome and, went on that rocket ship trajectory.
Right. Yeah, fascinating. And on a similar note, Dan, what are your thoughts on how big corporates can perhaps be less rigid and try to mimic the dynamism and of startups, and in so doing, effectively attract young talent? Do you have a view on that?
Yes, it's a really, really good question. Because I think, like, I'm hesitant, like, I'm a big supporter of the startup ecosystem, but, like, I worked, for a year at, Atlassian, which is kind of like a bigger tech company, and I had like a lot of fantastic learning there. And so I'm mindful not to tar all, big companies with the same brush. Like, some might be, kind of more traditional thinking, some might be really forward thinking. Yeah. Where I've seen big companies do really well is like, I think like number one, giving young talent high autonomy and high agency. So it's like if you give people a lot of like get really smart young people and almost like move out of their way, give them a lot of responsibility and autonomy to kind of like own their own initiatives, I think is like super powerful. And I think that's a big advantage that normally startups have that big companies can give. I think kind of, like point number two there is actually around like, and I think Google has this, I think it's 10% time, 20% time, but you'll see this concept across a couple of companies where giving candidates dedicated time to work on side projects within the company. So almost like you might be working on kind of like your main project, but like, candidates often have that creative entrepreneurial spark. And if you can find somewhere to put that spark internally, you can actually, as a company, capture all the upside of kind of that candidate's creativity and like give them the space to kind of, go and create something within the company. And I think that has kind of the third point around almost entrepreneurship. Something at Atlassian that was really cool was they had something called the Point A program, where you can actually pitch for internal funding at the company to go and launch like a new product for the company, or to go like get funding and, go and get a team to work on that. And what's really cool there is, there are opportunities increasingly, with like corporate venture firms and as well as like, kind of incubators within companies, or actually, you can do a lot of the stuff that an entrepreneur might do without necessarily the same risk. It's like, if this new product fails, you can just move to somewhere else within the company. And so I think like companies giving candidates the chance to like have almost that early stage environment within the company is actually really, really interesting. And the positioning there is, big companies can pay more. It's kind of lower job risk in terms of, okay, if you lose that job, you can move somewhere else within the company. You still get the brand credibility and recognition of oftentimes all these like, big tech brands, which are still well looked upon in the industry. And I think the final one is actually probably more around culture. You look at, a lot of startups are a lot more forward thinking around, like a lot of social causes. So diversity, equity, inclusion, climate change. Like these are a lot of like really big, pressing problems and conversations that are happening in society. And I think, Gen Z especially is really starting to look to, employers and actually demand kind of a stronger stand in terms of like how seriously they take these things. Like, is it just like a marketing puff piece where, you change the colors of your, or you make something, or are you making serious commitments towards, causes to build, a more just and equitable world? So I think companies that start to take a more for-purpose angle, whether that's doing foundations, whether that's giving, volunteering time to employees, whether that's, like having stricter standards about the sort of customers and suppliers they work with. There are several initiatives there where companies can show, hey, we're not just, like building something that, makes profit. We're not here just to build the biggest thing. We're also here to build the right thing. So I think that for-purpose flavor, the more that you can seriously, tangibly integrate that into your company's like, services as well as benefits for candidates, the stronger your positioning in the market when candidates, oftentimes have several opportunities that they're choosing from.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dan, you've mentioned how you want those as young as high schoolers to co-learn and navigate opportunities to work on high impact problems, which is related to what you were just talking about. And I think that this is in particular very meaningful. Could you elaborate a little bit on what you envision here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when it comes to high school students, it's super interesting, right? Like our scope right now for Earlywork, the primary scope is around university students and early career professionals, which we call, first up to 5 years of your career, but oftentimes it's, 1, 2, 3 years. High school obviously is like a little bit earlier. So we've primarily like, built for the university ecosystem where we kind of learnt the pain points, know those really well, recently firsthand. But, there shouldn't be, like a minimum age before you can start working,
right.
On awesome stuff, right? It's like, I think Generation Entrepreneur is a fantastic example of, an organization who's supporting student entrepreneurship in high schools. And actually, like through the Earlywork community, like I met, one student who actually joined while they were still in high school and ended up getting, their first ever tech internship through the Earlywork community. So there's already been kind of like anecdotal cases where like, we've had people join a little bit earlier than our usual focus and actually get amazing opportunities. And I think what's really, really powerful there is over time, it's not our primary focus now, but over time, we'll start to integrate more with the high school ecosystem. And the amazing opportunity is before someone's even choosing a degree, actually giving them tangible, practical experience in a lot of, future focused and forward thinking companies, gives them a stronger practical sense of, okay, like what's out there? What do I like? What do I not like? Because you think about the university degree selection process when people are in high school, and it's honestly just mind-blowing. Like we're getting people to commit to a debt of, often 3, 4 years, sometimes even 5 years, for this kind of hyper-specific path in terms of, going down a certain career trajectory, when really, like, for a lot of high school students, they have almost no data points in terms of professional work experience. And so there's another cool startup, Hex in Australia is doing some fantastic stuff where they've got, high school leaver programs to teach, high school leavers about entrepreneurship. You've got entry level who are, like doing almost like practical work experience courses online. Like there are a lot of fantastic players and organizations in Australia helping out with this space. I think at its core, we're a community-based company. And so like the long run there is starting to extend our community earlier and earlier to help people co-learn alongside each other and teach each other about what's out there, even earlier than university.
Very interesting. And to that end, I saw recently that you created an initiative over in Wollongong, which seemed to be like a co-living arrangement along those lines. Could you talk a little bit about that initiative?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a pretty fun experiment. I think, like in building the community, like we've been building throughout COVID, and I think it's been like, such a fantastic initiative in terms of giving young people, I think, especially kind of like in a sort of area, like a social fabric where oftentimes like, once you've left uni, if you're working for a startup, working for a company, you might be working remotely, you're kind of on your own. So there's a fantastic chance to actually help young people in the space meet each other, like have events with each other in person. And even though we're running a digital community, I'm a huge believer in physical community. I think the early home experiment kind of came out of like two core principles. I think, like building on that physical community idea. Number one, I think a lot about like as a founder, like one of the most impactful things for me has been the chance to learn from other creators. And I think co-living can be potentially one of the richest forms of co-learning in that you're spending a lot of time around other people who are, like very, positively minded, optimistic, and just creating things for the world, working on that, trying to improve that thing. I think when you get those people around each other, there's a really beautiful chance to, trade stories, trade lessons, and actually just give each other the confidence to actually create. Because I think it's like, I really struggled with this when I was, starting out writing and starting out community building. It can be like, pretty nerve wracking putting yourself out there. You kind of question like, oh, am I doing the right thing? Like, is this really going to make sense? When you're around other people who are creating, I think like it can really help to build that confidence, and courage is in short supply than genius. Right. So that's like one core thing around co-living, but then specifically Wollongong. So, right now I'm based in Sydney, but moving to Wollongong in a month or two. I think why we kind of looked at, an area like that is, it's kind of a good mix where, you're still close to Sydney, which is, a nexus for a lot of people in terms of, work and family. But I think, from my time, I'd spent some time volunteering, on farms, kind of throughout, like Sunshine Coast and Northern Rivers region, further up in Australia. And what I've really seen is, friends who are kind of like living in, smaller towns and cities where there was a really strong sense of connectedness between the community and like a really beautiful proximity to nature. So I think in terms of lifestyle, now that you have remote work, you don't need to go, working in a concrete block in the city every day. In terms of like kind of what is the most beautiful place to live and like a place to live that encourages like a really healthy lifestyle. I think there's something beautiful about living closer to nature. So it's kind of like, the nature element, and then the community thing. I think, growing up in Sydney, a lot of my friends live half an hour away, even an hour and a half away. Like Sydney's a big city, but the community is often actually like quite fragmented, and, you might not be close with your neighbors. My observation, and it's an experiment, right? My observation is that in a lot of these smaller cities and smaller towns, like the feeling of community is a lot more intimate, and people who are geographically co-located often have a stronger sense of connection. And so I think for us, like, in thinking about this, community that we're building, we're really trying to understand, over time, how does physical community integrate with that? And Early Home for us is almost like a first experiment in trying to go, okay, can we bring young founders and creators living together, surrounded by kind of this beautiful sort of natural environment, and see if that, provides a really enriching experience that helps these people to create things that give them a lot of meaning.
That's fantastic. I really love that, because I remember when I was in university, they did have these co-living arrangements. But very often, what I noticed was that it was very cliquish, and there wasn't that same artistic expression or spark where people would come together and co-build something. So I think it's amazing trying to very intentionally try to foster that or encourage that in that kind of context. I think is very interesting.
Yeah, it's I think it's such a beautiful community, right? And I think and there's one-off events and programs great for that, for helping them meet other people. But I think when you think about like community is not built overnight. Community takes time. And so when we think about physical community, I think like the co-living experiment we're going to be running for 6 months, and really the thesis there is that can you bring these young creative people together who are kind of like, they have a shared value in terms of wanting to create something that impacts a lot of people and something that's doing good for the world, and kind of like working on their own and trying to build something. And the question is like, can you get those people to build like a really powerful co-learning relationship between each other where they're just helping each other out and like, each helping each other to get better.
Yeah, fantastic. And Dan, finally, what do you think the biggest trends are in the future of workspace?
There's so many biggest trends in the future of workspace. I mean, the first one obviously that jumps around, like remote work is a huge shift in the ecosystem. And so the question is like, what comes from that? Macro trends you'll start to see in future of work. I think increasingly employers are becoming aware of and concerned about the mental wellness of employees. So like mental health in the workplace is becoming a bigger topic, and you'll start to see stronger tools and programs and products around employers ensuring that they have a mentally healthy workforce and healthy teams. Number two, in terms of future of work, I think kind of like the rise of for-purpose business. Like you look at, Canva doing a recent raise and actually giving a lot of that money directly to the kind of the Canva Foundation. So you're starting to see a lot of top entrepreneurs in Australia actually thinking about social impact earlier, even if they are building more traditional software businesses. But along with that, you're seeing for-purpose businesses taking on the B Corp model. So you think about Sendel in Australia, you think about Culture Amp. There are some terrific companies, ensuring that have a strong commitment to people and the planet. Other trends in the future of work, I think you're starting to see. Obviously, it goes without saying, like Web3 is a huge trend, and with that comes, the chance to actually work on DAOs. So people getting paid as almost like core contributors and working on several DAOs is super interesting. I've got several friends now who they've literally quit their jobs and full time they're just doing a bunch of different Web3 projects. So there's a fascinating question around how do you help people work on projects that they own a part of and kind of get rewarded for as they work in kind of a more democratic system. I think kind of the other thing as well, just around taking a step back broadly around career search, I think is kind of the rise of alternative education and alternative education communities. So with kind of oftentimes what's called the declining relevance of traditional university degrees, at least for business and tech type roles, you're starting to see this huge rise in places like On Deck and Reforge and StartMate running a bunch of cool programs to help people break into emerging industries. I think increasingly the macro trend, very much Earlywork is betting on, is the rise for and need for community. Community, to me, is the single biggest gap in education today. You can get Harvard quality education online, right? Right. You go on edX, you go on Coursera, there are world-class courses. The problem is, only, I think it's something like 3% of those massive online courses actually get completed. Right. And so when you accountability, I think the biggest thing actually just comes down to community. What university has, the most valuable thing is the social cohort. So the question is, can you extract that social cohort from university and actually give people that co-learning pool that allows them to explore education, explore career without having to spend tens of thousands of dollars on a degree?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes sense. And yeah, that definitely resonates with me as well, because I remember there were periods where I had to do online learning from abroad while I was studying at university. And obviously you're completely disconnected. And I think that in this context now, especially with COVID, you get a sense of how important the community aspect is, and that it's not necessarily just the degree. But I think the problem there is that very often you have some students have an unfair advantage in terms of their inherent network compared to others. So it's easy to assume, yeah, exactly. It's easy to assume that everyone's experience in a given university is going to more or less be equal, but I find that that's very often not the case, and it is very cliquish. So I think being intentional about shaping the community, I think, is a great initiative.
And that's why, look, if you look at the very core of Earlywork, the content, 100% free. The community, 100% free. The amount of people that have told us to, I'll just charge for the content, charge for the community. I think there may be ways to do it for kind of parts of the content community, but to be honest, I think at its core, we want to build something that empowers the long tail. It's the idea is it shouldn't just be reliant on your network. It shouldn't just be reliant on you got access to this education and someone else didn't. We want to democratize that base layer so that everyone has high quality career education and everyone has an opportunity to access a pool of other people who are co-learning alongside them. You democratize that base layer, you get young people helping each other, and we think that we can create just the most amazing generation of young founders, creators, and operators that Australia and New Zealand has seen yet, and hopefully other countries over time.
Cool, fantastic. Well, all the best with creating Earlywork, and we'll be following the progress. And thanks so much for joining us on the Humaniiize Podcast, Dan.
Cheers, Eric. Ciao for now. To be continued. And if you're keen to see what we do, check out earlywork.co.
Yeah, absolutely.